Welcome back to Beyond the Bench, the podcast from Mountain States Legal Foundation, where we explore the cases, people, and principles shaping the fight for liberty in America. Today, we are joined by Abhishek Kambli. He served as Deputy Associate Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice, where he acted as lead counsel in high priority matters for the Trump administration. He also served as Deputy Attorney General and Division Chief of the Special Litigation and Constitutional Issues Division at the Kansas Attorney General's Office. Along with experience at the Southern District of Indiana, Abhi is also Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Air Force Judge Advocate General Corps, having served on active duty and in the reserves since 2013. Now a partner at Holtzman Vogel, who represents clients in high-stakes appellate and complex litigation, constitutional challenges, and matters involving state attorney generals and federal agencies. Abhi, it is great to have you, and thanks for joining us for a conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
My gosh, you've done a lot. You're a busy man.
Yeah, try to.
This man is definitely not picking up the phone on Saturdays and Sundays. He's busy Monday through Friday, and I love to see it. So real quick, just to start us off, before becoming a largely successful attorney and prosecutor, who was Abhi growing up? What would surprise people the most?
Yeah, so I grew up in Connecticut. I were originally born in India. So background-wise, what would surprise people the most? Yeah, my grandmother, she on my dad's side, she was illiterate, so uh, definitely did not. And then my dad worked at a gas station, so definitely not the traditional background that a lawyer comes from. So I was the first lawyer that probably in my immediate family. So that's something that people might not know.
Nice. And really, what drove you to law then? I mean, you have so many different passions. You have a lot of different experiences growing up. So, what kind of sparked that interest and drove you towards law in the first place?
Yeah, so ultimately, the easy answer is I took my dad's advice and went to law school. I studied film in college and worked in the entertainment industry for a couple of years, didn't like it at all. And so it started off as just kind of following my parents' advice and doing something more practical, which I don't know if everyone necessarily sees law as the practical path these days, but I did that. And then through going to law school, I wanted to serve and, practice law at the same time. And that's what led me to going active duty as a lawyer in the military. So, yeah, just kind of rest. And then I found myself doing all kinds of interesting things just based on where my career took me.
Yeah, and I like how you touched on how you wanted to serve while also practicing law. And I mean, you've worked at pretty much every position that law can offer. I mean, as a prosecutor, military officer, state litigator, and now, I mean, finishing up your role at the federal level. So, out of all of those, which role do you think taught you the most about human nature?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Definitely serving in the administration. You kind of see uh, I kind of got a chance to, in a leadership office to see the full scale of what DOJ does, and it's a lot. So we supervise the Civil Rights Division, which does a lot of the affirmative civil rights cases. We supervise the Civil Division, which, among other things, handles every aspect where the administration gets sued. And you kind of see a lot about the human nature of judges, of people opposing us, and yeah, so just kind of seeing the wide scope of what DOJ handles. I mean, the United States is the most sued entity in the world, and kind of seeing the people that are involved in that process. And then obviously, as a political appointee, we're dealing with every, political appointee across agencies, the White House, and just seeing how all that works was probably the most interesting experience I've had so far.
Yeah, and especially because you worked in one of the busiest positions, right? I mean, and even then, not even the busiest position, but then also the busiest entity within law. You're getting sued left and right. You're having to kind of bounce back and forth between different cases. So I'm curious, what does a typical day kind of look like when you were in that position at the DOJ? Is there ever like a consistency to the schedule, or is it kind of just every day looks different?
Yeah, every day. It's not an overstatement to say every day is different. So the DOJ has kind of an odd structure. So you have, and that's existed well before this administration. So you have the Attorney General, obviously, and you have the Deputy Attorney General, who's the number two, and then you have the Associate Attorney General, who I worked for. And the Associate Attorney General supervises everything civil that happens within DOJ. But one of the things that was different about this particular administration is that the Associate's office was also involved in a lot of litigation too. So we were involved in a lot of the affirmative cases, and then obviously I did a number of the defensive cases too. So uh, the Associate's office kind of got to do both, and that's one of the pleasures of the job.
Absolutely. And then even if we're turning back the clock, you did a lot of, like you said, you've been serving since 2013. So your military service includes criminal trials as both prosecutor, defense attorney, I mean, appellate representation before the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, and even representation of a high-profile detainee, which I thought was super interesting, before the military commissions at Guantanamo Bay, nonetheless. So what's a lesson from the Air Force that most lawyers could benefit from learning? That's a very unique perspective that you bring as well.
Yeah, so the Air Force did, that's where I began my legal career and shaped a lot of what I've done. And one of the unique parts about the Air Force is they rotate us in assignments every couple of years. So we got to see a wide variety of things. And just because of how it's structured, like, I got to be both the prosecutor and the defense attorney. Typically, people do one for a long time and maybe eventually go do the other. But seeing that and then having to balance both being an officer in the military and kind of doing the legal work too. That was just an interesting thing overall. And one of the things that I think the Air Force in particular trains people on that most lawyers don't get training on is how to be a leader. And being a good leader, I think, definitely helps in the law as well, especially if you're leading other people. So, at a firm, it involves leading associates that, might be working with me in a project and understanding what good leadership looks like and how to take care of the people under you. That part lawyers don't really get, and I think that was definitely helpful from my time serving in the military. That beyond just the legal training.
Yeah, I'm curious to actually touch on that point. So, what does it mean to be a good leader as a lawyer, or at the DOJ, or working with other attorneys? What does that look like, or what does that mean to you?
Yeah, and I think big picture, most lawyers, and this applies actually beyond the law in the world generally. There's not enough training in because leadership is a skill in itself, and there's just not a lot of training, and people get promoted to wherever they are based on how good they are at their jobs, but no one's told or given training on exactly how to be the type of leader that gets the best out of the people under you. So for instance, you can do only so much as one individual person, but if you train the people that you're leading to also do a lot of good stuff, it becomes a force multiplier that that goes well beyond what you as a one individual person can do. And that definitely applied a lot at DOJ because there is, there is a lot of delegating that's required. And the attorneys that we had as kind of our counsel are some of the sharpest attorneys, but they don't obviously have as much experience as me. So kind of understanding how, like, if we have a project, especially like let's say a big picture litigation project that might, involve one issue, but then spawn off into a series of cases, understanding how to get to the point where I can help get the project launched, but then eventually what success looks like is me handing it off to someone else and then not having to get involved day to day. And I think a lot of lawyers struggle with kind of understanding why that's a good thing when someone can take a project from you and run with it.
Absolutely. A lot of being a leader comes with, kind of building that trust, but also that trust comes from practice and having the confidence in what you've done before. I like to hear that. Uh, I do kind of want to even keep touching on a little bit on that service. What was maybe even the most interesting thing that you've seen or experienced as a leader in the or at the Air Force in one of those rotations that you were talking about, whether it was as a self-defense or as a prosecutor?
Yeah, so I think as a prosecutor, one of the roles that I had early in my career was it was a role called Chief of Military Justice. So in every base, what's called base legal office, there's a staff judge advocate who's typically a lieutenant colonel. a deputy step judge advocate who's a major, and then among the captains, there's a chief military justice that effectively handles ensuring all the military court martials are running properly at that base. And that typically involves having a staff of a couple attorneys under me and then, a number of paralegals. So, maybe a year and a half into my time in the military, I had to take on that role and learning as a relatively new lawyer how to manage people, how to get the best out of them, and then also how to make sure that they're advancing and, are happy themselves. And that's definitely something that's taken, that's carried over for every legal assignment. So when I'm a lot of like, let's say at a different law firm where it's like big law, for instance, the tendency tends to be for partners to grind whatever they can out of their associates, and then that just results in them getting burned out and then wanting to go away from that. So learning how to do that is about avoiding those tendencies and, thinking more about what the people under you want to do and where they want to go in life and their career and how you can be a resource for them and how you can ultimately help them. So sometimes it might involve, if there's in DOJ, there were sometimes opportunities where I could have done an argument, but it might have been better for one of the younger attorneys to get that experience. And if they're, ready for that and well prepared, then good leadership means giving them that opportunity rather than taking it for myself. So things like that are little things that can go a long way in making sure people are one, happy in where they are, but also that ensures that you're getting the best performance out of them too.
Absolutely. And especially, knowing when to step back, leading doesn't always necessarily mean being at the forefront and taking everything on yourself. And I like how you made that point as well. And that even eventually led you to like you said, the DOJ and taking kind of on that role of high stake litigation and moving up to kind of the biggest, law department in the nation. So I'm curious, we're gonna kind of dig into that a little bit as well. So how do you separate politics from legal analysis when the public often treats them as the same thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, being a political appointee within an administration, we're there to advance the president's agenda. But at the same time, the main thing that DOJ deals with, especially in the litigating components, are Article 3 courts. So, it's a balance of both. So, for instance, we have whatever legal issue we're being sued on, you obviously have the legal standard. But at the same time, there is going to be a public messaging element to it. So obviously, the president promised certain things, and DOJ is part of what delivers on that. So having the messaging of, let's say we're defending an executive order, there's legal issues, but at the same time, we also want to make sure that why it's important doesn't get lost in all of it. And that's where kind of having the political instincts and understanding that plays into effect, and knowing how to balance both is kind of one of the unique skills that DOJ attorneys in particular that are political appointees have to develop.
Absolutely, yeah. Picking your battles, right? And conserving your resources and making sure that, you can efficiently fight that fight is extremely important. And like you said, I mean that those Article 3 courts, sometimes, there's things that you may not necessarily agree with, or, even things that you are very passionate about. Was there ever a time where you've argued a position that you've personally wrestled with?
I mean, one of the things that we're doing as administration, we've been sued about 600 times. And part of it is, these executive orders, they are creating precedents. So a lot of the times it's not so much wrestling with, what I view as the law. It's really setting precedent that law students will, read about in decades. And we're effectively creating what the law looks like as we speak, since a lot of these cases tend to go to the Supreme Court, or it are eligible to go to the Supreme Court, and it creates the precedent. So it's really wrestling with new and novel legal issues that haven't really been tested, more than it is wrestling with whether I believe in the law eh, that's as stated or not. Like, for
Yeah.
instance, in the removal cases, that's with Humphrey's executor, that's shaping up to reset the landscape as to whether the president can hire who he wants within the executive branch. So sometimes it's just understanding that it is creating new territory and understanding the best way to navigate that.
Yeah, exactly. Especially as times goes on, there's more and more gray areas, and as the DOJ's responsibility to kind of lay the supreme law of the land, sometimes that won't be tested until, only time can really answer that question. So in your opinion, what's the biggest misconception Americans have about how major constitutional lawsuits come together?
Yeah, so I think the big thing that people take for granted is that these cases that you see that end up in the Supreme Court, the ideas that are behind them, they're not self-executing. They involve someone, litigating them both at the trial court level, then the immediate appellate level, and then the Supreme Court level. And I think people take for granted that if someone's not making those arguments, advocating for those positions, and navigating through all that, then it just doesn't happen. So, like the Humphreys executor cases, it involves someone, you know, multiple people litigating that at the trial court level, sometimes taking losses, then litigating it in the appellate in the DC circuit in those cases, sometimes winning, sometimes not winning, and then at sometimes taking it to the Supreme Court. So it takes a lot of work to actually get to the point where you get that seminal Supreme Court case that where we should hopefully prevail, but it involved multiple people putting in the effort to make the arguments and navigating how to, respond to setbacks and adverse decisions and navigating it all the way up to where we ultimately believe the right position should be.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, you've been in the attorney, the law game a long time. Do you remember your first major case?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on kind of how you define major. But yeah, I mean, one of the first case that I personally argued at the Kansas AG's office was, I don't know if you're familiar with the Biden v. Nebraska case where the court struck down student loan forgiveness. There was a part two of that that came afterwards, and Kansas led a lawsuit on it. So my first argument in Kansas was on part two, which was a $475 billion loan forgiveness program.
Yeah, that's a lot of zeros. That's a
Yeah,
whole lot of zeros, a lot of commas.
yeah,
And so like I mean, I've never been in the position, arguing for that kind of, I guess, under that kind of pressure. So when you're preparing for a major case, of that caliber, I mean, you've also done it now, time over time. What are aspects of that preparation that kind of make you lose sleep, or maybe even the opposite, that make you kind of like hyper focused, in that position?
yeah. And I think, for me, like everybody's different, but those major cases that, you know, law students could be reading about in decades, that really, I think, is a huge motivating factor more than anything. And that type of work is why I got into this line of work to begin with. So it is exciting. And I think that some people, some lawyers, they want to avoid the cases where everyone's paying attention and they could be picked apart on everything that they're doing right or doing wrong. And for me, I actually, welcome that scrutiny because that forces me to bring the best out of my preparation. And, I know that someone's going to be nitpicking everything that I do. That actually is something that I welcome and something that I want so that my preparation ends up being much better as a result of that. And that way, and it oftentimes results in me being even more prepared than some of the judges that are questioning me.
Wow, I love that answer, I'm actually. So if we were to dig a little bit in on that, as a even as a law student, right? Growing up before you were arguing, was there actually a major case that maybe inspired you, that kind of gave you that mentality of like, preparation is everything, or you really loved how somebody else prepared themselves and you're like, all right, I have to do it kind of like that, or kind of set the standard.
Yeah, I don't think there was anyone in particular, but in everyone else in law school has to do kind of a moot um, oral argument, and I got to do some preparation, like, or got to do that, and it ended up, you know, feeling very natural for me to do that, and it's somewhere that I like the in court stand up, making the argument is something that I really enjoyed and wanted to pursue. And a lot of people they specialize in one thing. So some people specialize in trial court level work, others, appellate. I kind of do everything. So having that variety is something that's a little bit different. And getting that kind of experience is kind of what drove me to kind of keep wanting to do it. So like in my time in DOJ, I might have done, I think I did in the 15 or so months that I was there, I did about 22 arguments. So each one I learned something else, and um, it builds a bank of knowledge that I keep improving on with each one.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so we were kind of continuing on. You've had these day to days. You've faced these major cases. So what does a good or a smooth day in constitutional litigation look like? And then what does maybe even like a bad or a rough day in constitutional litigation look like? I mean, you're dealing with so many things, so many different revolving doors and different levels of courts. So yeah, what does a good and a bad day look like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's any such thing as a good or bad day. It just, you obviously get some good news and some bad news each day. Like, we've, obviously been sued a ton of times, and we also do a lot of affirmative cases. So getting victories is obviously good news, and getting losses tends to be bad news. But uh, kind of navigating how to turn bad news into good news. So I obviously won't get into deliberations on any particular case, but when we get a loss, there's more than one person involved in the conversation as to what to do next, and then navigating towards what our end goal is and how to get there. So I think resilience is something that we develop a lot because plaintiffs choose the forum that they sue us in when we're in DOJ. And often they're not going to go to the place that's the worst possible place. They go to a place because they think that's the best chance of getting a good result. So we're oftentimes in places like Massachusetts or San Francisco or somewhere like that where, you know, they're drawing a judge that is likely to rule in their favor. So understanding that we are going to face losses initially, and then the bigger question is not so much that, but what we do afterwards. And I think that's kind of what kind of is day to day life like there. And then also just strategizing where we fit into the big picture. There's sometimes going to be five different lawsuits on a topic, understanding how they all fit together, or what our affirmative agenda is, what type of lawsuits that DOJ wants to bring, and kind of how to strategically bring those. So all of those are kind of what happens in any given day.
Yeah, I mean, law is a game of chess. I mean, you're making moves now, but it's for something that may be, 5, 10, 20 steps ahead. And you have to kind of think of that offense and defensive of, what do I have to put forward? What do I have to draw back on? And I like how earlier you stated that, it's all about the big picture. You have to look about what will this mean for the future, for law students, for the supreme law of the land. And I kind of want to get your 2 cents on the big picture of government power and really just the Constitution as well. So, what's a constitutional issue you think will define the next 20 years?
I think one of the issues that we're definitely litigating is executive power generally. So Humphrey's executor goes towards, that, and we're dealing with a lot of cases that involve firing uh, of employees within the federal branch, like through RIFs. And the big issue, I think, is whether the executive branch belongs to the president or whether it belongs to an unelected bureaucracy. And that's an issue that we're definitely going to get some answers on from the Supreme Court as to what the bounds of that are. And I think that's going to be something that is going to affect the presidency, for decades to come.
And if you could force, I mean not force, but if you could highly recommend every American to read maybe even just one Supreme Court opinion. Which one would it be and why?
Yeah, so I think to give an idea of where we're at, I think reading the Humphreys executor line of cases, and there's some other cases like Seal of Law that involve the CFPB and things like that. I think understanding those lines of cases will help orient people towards the removal cases that are happening right now. And I think because one of the things that's shaping up is whether Humphrey's executor gets overturned or not. And I think that's probably going to be one of the most important issues that gets decided probably within the next couple weeks by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and again, just a lot of pulling strings and making sure that you're looking at the big picture. While also, I mean, especially with the, I mean, 250th anniversary, we're looking at stuff like the Constitution now more than ever. You know, we're looking at a lot of older documents to remind ourselves how do we balance one issue over the other. And I'm curious how should courts balance changing social values against a Constitution that was written, centuries ago?
Yeah, I mean, the Constitution obviously is going to remain the same. And I think the big issue that, in addition to kind of what executive power looks like, is whether courts can recognize the limitation on their own power. So, one of the things that's been an issue is um, district courts ignoring the limits on what Article 3 can and can't do and giving relief on things that they're never supposed to give relief on. So I think that that's going to be that's been a battle that's played out numerous times in various circumstances. And I think that that's also going to be something that's going to be decided during this presidency.
And I know a lot of people have,
It tends to be one where courts ignore jurisdictional limits because they don't like what the president's doing, and then kind of twisting those limits to, you know, get a plaintiff into court and then grant relief that's really broad.
yeah, especially the balance of state versus federal, right? And you're always balancing that, and you have. I mean, you've done it from Kansas, you've done it from Indiana, and you've done it from the DOJ. So you're fighting both sides of that line as well.
Yeah.
And in your experience, what separates a good legal argument from a great legal argument, something that stands out and gets you to the Supreme Court or gets you that win?
Yeah, I think precision is kind of what makes the difference because sometimes when you dig it, like especially for appellate arguments, um, you have to really dig in to, when you're dealing with a bunch of cases, some of which might not quite be on point, but understanding how the different threads work together and create something and being precise as to what that something is and then sticking with that position. That's kind of what makes the difference because there's some good legal arguments where you know the law, you can apply it to the facts and you do a competent job of that, but understanding with precision where the law is and where you want it to head, I think understanding with that level of precision is kind of what makes the difference.
And was there a single or most surreal interaction that you've had because of your role at the DOJ?
So yeah, I've had many. So I think the most recent one was doing the law firm executive order argument. It was definitely a once in a lifetime experience. I can't get into the details of the case too much since I've, personally litigated that one, but I can share kind of my impressions at oral argument. So it was in the DC circuit, and this was the one that involved the presidential executive orders on certain big law firms, and four of them ended up litigating the case. And if you look at kind of who they hired and who was at counsel's table, so it was me on one side, and then on the other side, Paul Clement was doing the argument, and at counsel's table was Elizabeth Prelogar, who was the Biden era Solicitor General, Don Brody, who was the Obama era Solicitor General, and then another partner from a big law firm. And kind of having that experience of me going against all that, that was one of the most
Yeah, you're dealing with a lot of titans, right? A lot of the big names of the big names, the people you see, on the news constantly and in the briefs. And I can't imagine what it's like kind of even, being in that position as well. But even looking kind of towards the future and towards the big picture, what is a belief you had or held 10 years ago that you've either changed your mind or about or had a even a change in perspective, arguing these kind of cases and seeing these kind of Titan style, arguments. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I've definitely taken a more nuanced view of executive orders. Uh, I mean, there is a lot of power within the executive branch where, if executive orders stick within the bounds of what the president's power are, they can do a lot of good. I think where it gets into trouble is where the executive takes on what's normally reserved for Congress, and obviously that's going to, what that looks like in varies based on what the exact issue is. But 10 years ago, I might have just reflexively just been against the idea of executive orders without thinking about that. But given that there's a stalemate effectively in Congress where not a lot gets done, and the president makes promises to the voters to enact certain things, there should be an avenue where the president, within the bounds of his own power, is allowed to achieve things through executive action. So I think that's one where where I've definitely been more nuanced than I might have been 10 years ago.
Yeah, and coming up on, like I stated earlier, that anniversary, we're looking back a lot of rules of law, a lot of old documents, and I mean, you've been practicing and seen so many different experiences, and if you could send one message to Americans about the rule of law, what would it be?
Well, that's a big question. So, yeah, I think, there's been a lot of talk about the executive power and, how to hold, or how to block things that people believe that the president is doing that's unlawful. But I think the big picture, thing to think about is what is the check on, you know, when judges go out of their lane. So, for instance, you had, you know, normally, for the most part, the appellate process does what it's supposed to and corrects those errors. But, even in odd situations like what happened in the 11th Circuit with the one judge that was accused of misconduct, and how the 11th Circuit, in some people's views, did not take the appropriate action. When you have a judge with lifetime tenure, the only option at that point is impeachment. So if the judiciary isn't regulating itself and Congress isn't taking the steps that it needs to impeach when there's misconduct, then you know what does that say about judicial power in modern times? So I think thinking about what judicial power and Article 3 power looks like, and when judges are not, kind of exercising whatever their expectation is on limiting their own power and engaging in good behavior, what is the check on that is kind of one of the big picture questions that I think doesn't get thought about enough, but is something that should be thought about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I mean, I'm not personally a graduate of any law school, but, as the average American, I think a lot of people forget that it's not so, one and two sided. It's not just plaintiff versus defendant. I mean, you also have, like you said, that judge that's supposed to be weighing it equally or, supposed to be taking in what's the best of the people. And a lot of people forget about that. And I think especially with amicus briefs, it can almost look like a Dungeon and Dragons style like
Mm-hmm.
dice roll. There's just so many different factors that play into it and a lot of different angles that an argument can be taken from, and trying to take that in could be almost overwhelming. So
Mm-hmm.
when history looks back at this era of constitutional and political conflict, what do you think people 50 years from now will say, we got it right? And what will they say we got wrong?
Yeah, so, I think one of the things that historically we've done wrong is grow the administrative state to a very large scale, and then had congressional statutes which prevented the administrative state from getting smaller. So I think historically that's something that we've done wrong. But I think the Supreme Court is going a long way towards correcting a lot of that through things like the president's removal authority or the executive branch's ability to, decide who gets to work within it. So I think reclaiming executive power is one area that we're getting it right. One area that remains to be seen that I don't think we the courts across the country are getting it right at the moment is federal preemption, especially in the immigration context. Um, we've had situations where sanctuary jurisdictions, a lot of courts have said, states that try to thwart federal immigration enforcement, that even though federal law is the supreme law of the land, that's okay in terms of that's not something that violates the supremacy clause. But at the same time, you've had a number of courts that when states pass statutes like, such as statutes that prevent you from illegally re-entering within the state, and they try to complement federal law and assist federal immigration authorities, the courts have also been saying that that's preempted. So you can't have a situation in the long term where federal law, or state law that complements federal law is preempted, while state law that tries to thwart federal immigration enforcement is not. I don't think that's going to be something that people look back on and say that that was correct.
Absolutely. Precision is everything, right? I mean, you
Yeah,
stated that earlier. And I mean, you've done a lot at the DOJ, you've done a lot in your career. I mean, you're yet to do even more. You're not done. Abhi is still, yeah, has a lot of fight still left in him, but this might even be a big picture question as well. Well, it is going to be a big picture question as well. When people look back at your career, what do you hope that they say you stood for?
yeah. So I think big picture, I do hope that one of the things that I hope that people would say is that um, I never turned down the arguing something because it might have been unpopular in some circles. So, for instance, a lot of people did not like some of the cases that I might have defended at DOJ, and but a lot of those same people would say, "Yeah, of course we would represent unpopular positions." So I think that um, actually doing that in terms of, you know, within legal quarters, some of the cases might not have been the most popular. In other parts, they are. But that I also focused on what the legal issues were and stood up for the for getting the law correct on those.
Amazing, amazing. And we're so honored to have you on here, especially because we know what you're doing and we know what you're yet to do and how much passion you put into your arguments as well. However, we're making it a tradition around here to end on a little bit of a lightning round just to kind of reel us back in and
Sure.
not be so, deep all the time and then it right there, So if you're ready, we're going to jump right into it and make it kind of easy breezy and then wrap it up.
Sure.
All right, so first one. What legal movie or television show captures law most accurately?
Hmm. So actually, you know, it has its embellishments, but A Few Good Men actually does a reasonably good job of capturing what a military court-martial looks like.
Okay, okay. And then which Supreme Court case deserves a Netflix style documentary?
Yeah, that's a good one. Hmm. Yeah, I think we'll see how some of the maybe you think. Let me get back to you on that one since I want to put a little thought into that. I know it's
Yeah,
lightning round,
absolutely.
but
No,
that's a
it's
good one.
okay. It's all right. We can get that one later. And then which Supreme Court justice, living or dead, would you most want to have dinner with?
I would say, yeah, probably Justice Scalia.
It's a great answer. And then which constitutional amendment generates the most confusion?
So I think in many ways, let me think about that one. I think the 14th Amendment definitely generates the most confusion. We obviously that see that playing out in birthright citizenship, like with the question of what does it mean to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and I obviously believe that it doesn't mean that if you happen to be born here that you automatically get citizenship. So I think interpretation of the 14th Amendment probably has a lot caused some of the most confusion.
Precision is everything. And then the last one that we have for you is what's the hardest question you've been asked by a judge, if you can answer it?
Yeah, probably not in terms of, I try to avoid talking about cases that I litigated. But yeah, the goal is always to be prepared for anything. So in an ideal world, nothing catches me off guard. But I think, without naming any circumstances or any individual cases, I think the judges that are clearly not spun up on the case and what the law is on the matter, those are actually the toughest questions because you kind of have to walk the judge back from square one when you're assuming a certain level of knowledge. So I think the less a judge knows, the harder the argument is in some ways.
Yeah, especially like I mean, even building on precision, right? Storytelling is everything, and sometimes you kind of gotta sell the story two or three times. And then just to kind of circle back, is there a Supreme Court case that you think deserves a Netflix style documentary?
Yeah, among ones that haven't already been done, yeah, maybe some of these removal cases I think might one day deserve a Netflix documentary to see, kind of what happened and how we got here and where it ultimately ends up.
Absolutely, and I couldn't have said it any better. And I know that uh, a lot of it is hot cases, like what we were talking on earlier. A lot of press coverage, a lot of interviews, a lot of requests. And Abby, you did great today, and we are absolutely honored to have you. And we appreciate what you're doing for the fight for liberty, as well as what you're continuing and yet to do. So, to wrap it up, if you've enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe and follow Beyond the Bench wherever you get your podcasts, and visit mslegal.org to learn more about how you can stand with us in defending the Constitution. My name is Noah Daskow, joined by Abi, and we will see you next time to go Beyond the Bench. And I will click
And that was exactly
pause.